Right. Well, welcome very much to this webinar hosted by the Economic Innovation Group, Navigating COVID-19, Addressing the Economic Impact and Launching an Equitable Recovery. My name is Catherine Lyons. I am the Manager of Policy and Coalitions here at EIG. I'm going to kick us off with just a couple of housekeeping items. The first is that we are recording this webinar and it will be posted on our website afterward. The second is that we welcome your submission of questions throughout this discussion. Please submit in the Q&A box that is on the platform. We will aim to get to as many questions as possible in the last few minutes of this webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to EIG's President and CEO, John Lettieri.
Yes, thanks, Catherine, and welcome everybody. We're pleased that you could join us for this important conversation. We're honored today to have two of EIG's Economic Advisory Board members, Dr. Kenneth Rogoff and Dr. Austin Goolsbee, to discuss lessons from the Great Recession and how they should inform our response to the current crisis and planning for the recovery. So just to introduce our two guests, Ken is a professor of economics at the Thomas D. Cabot Professor for Public Policy at Harvard University and a former chief economist for the International Monetary Fund. Austin is the Robert P. Gwynne Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. He was previously the chairman of President Barack Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, as well as the chief economist for the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board. So thank you for being with us today, gentlemen. To begin, I want to pose a question to both of you. We've seen the gaudy numbers, and every time a new data release comes out, it challenges our ability to use the word unprecedented to the proper effect. Today we have data that says over 38 million workers have filed for unemployment since the president declared a state of emergency. So we know that this is a severe crisis, but perhaps you could set the table for us on just what we're dealing with here. What's unique about this? How severe is it? And how concerned are you about where we stand today? Ken, maybe you could kick us off.
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty severe. It's the most severe natural catastrophe we've faced in generations. And, you know, what's different today really is that we're in this position to be able to close down, which we really couldn't 100 years ago, and now we can, and that has a lot of implications. So it's very tough. It's very uncertain. I don't know whether we're going to have a second wave in the fall, in the spring. The vaccines, will they actually come? Will there be antiviral treatments? There's enormous uncertainty. But if you look at what's happened already, the depths of the dive that we felt, and I think this is going to last in some form for a long time, I think we're probably looking at certainly the deepest recession globally in 150 years, and we don't know when it's going to end.
Look, Ken's got the historical context to put that in. I guess I would say, if you just look at unemployment, the worst year of the Depression, the unemployment rate went up by 8 percentage points in 1 year. We went up more than 10% in 1 month. So nothing like this has ever happened this rapidly before. There is a silver lining, maybe, that since what caused this had nothing to do with the economy and came on more suddenly than any economic crisis has, maybe it could at least partly recover faster than a normal economic crisis. The normal rules of recovery say that even in a boom, the unemployment rate comes down 1.5 points a year. So if we're going to go to the regular rule book, we're going to be a decade or more before we're looking at anything like healing. Hopefully we don't have to do that. I'm kind of in the space that says throw more and everything at the slowing the spread of the virus, because the lockdown is not really legally driven. The free fall of the economy has come about from fear. And I think the policy component of that is only on the margin. And I think you see that in states where they're reopening, like in Georgia. The demand comeback is not nearly as big as what they as what they lost, and it's not nearly as big as what they expected, it's because fundamentally people are still afraid that they're going to go out and get sick.
Yeah, I just want to second what Austin said, that, the main enemy is the virus. And, an analogy might be if you're in a war and somebody says, well, are you keeping full employment at home? That's actually not necessarily the core question, which is how are you doing in the war? And I think that's still unfolding. I hope it's better in the summer, but as I just said a few moments earlier, I'm quite concerned we'll get a wave in the fall and the spring. And we haven't even talked about the rest of the world, where the waves are likely to go on for years. If you look back at the Spanish influenza, I think 1920, it started in 1918. I think 1920 killed the most people. So we're in a way different world. We have better science, vaccines, I understand that, but it's a very uncertain world.
But John, look, I'll tell you, and I can even supplement with video. There is there is an optimistic scenario. And the optimistic scenario says, if you look at other countries, even without a vaccine, there are countries that have been able to get control of the spread of the virus. They mostly have used a lot of testing early type approach, but the unemployment rate did not go up very much in Korea, did not go up very much in Germany. And you've seen their economies start to recover. So maybe we could get on to a path that's better, but the uncertainties that Ken is talking about, we're just going to have to live with them. I mean, if we get a 1920 type wave, like what they had with influenza, we're going to have to go back into lockdown. I mean, that's just what it's going to be. And we're going to see a whole nother wave of millions more people losing their jobs.
Austin, based on what you've seen so far and what you've both described in terms of the severity of the crisis, would you say that Congress and the administration fundamentally understand the scale and the scope of this? What would you say are the blind spots?
I don't think it's a secret to say I have been critical of the administration's approach. I think at the highest level, the root problem was kind of a philosophical, that the president himself and a large component of the administration wanted this to go away and wanted not to acknowledge the size of the problem and not to move rapidly. And you see that still reflected in the ideas of some of the governors of don't test, because if you test, then you find out that there are more cases, and just the reporting of more cases is what's bad. I hope that the administration will get to the recognition that it's not a trade-off. In my view, it's definitely not a trade-off between saving lives or saving jobs. I think that's the totally wrong way to think about it. That the countries that are saving jobs the best are the countries that prioritize the saving of lives. And the part of the equation there is it's fear. What's killing the economy is fear. And just saying, we're going to reopen so everybody can go back out, when everyone knows that if you just go back out without knowing who has the virus and is asymptomatic, you could very likely catch it. That won't work. So I hope the administration gets to that point, but I haven't been that confident that they will.
Yeah, I would just pitch in on that first of all, Asia, we really don't know what's next. If a vaccine comes, their approach will look great and they'll have, kept things together. But if it doesn't, probably remains to unfold. There's Sweden at the other extreme, where they've sort of, they obey rules in Sweden, maybe more than we do. And they've been able to contain it, keep their economy going also. And so I think some of the distinctions in our unemployment in Europe's are a bit superficial, because Europe was paying firms to keep their workers, paying their rents even. And if this goes on, they can't continue to do that, and they'll have to be releasing workers. On the other hand, if we have good fortune and we come back, I think we'll have lost a lot of firms, a lot of things have gone wrong, but a lot of people will come back to their old jobs. So it's, it's hard to know. The virus is so uncertain. It's hard to know how we should be playing this. But I don't think anybody's going to say the U.S. played it well. I haven't heard that from anybody who thinks we did a great job on containing the virus, having a national policy, managing, and how much of it is Congress and the administration, how much of it is, the strengths and weaknesses of our being Americans, I don't know. But the situation in New York is particularly acute, but just, nationally, we certainly have had a tough time.
The thing is, if you look at a country like Korea, maybe you say it's sufficiently different, it's hard to apply the lessons of what Korea did to the US. But if you look at a country like Australia, they had a big public debate about many of the similar issues that we're debating now in the US, like freedom and how long should we be shut down and when should we come out. But they've really hammered the spread of the virus, and that is what sets the stage for the economy to come back, I think. And it's not, remember, the virus is the boss. It's not the presidents to choose. It's not the governors to choose. It's not the mayors to choose. You can announce whatever you want. You could say, everybody go back. I, President Trump, order you to go back to work. But the thing is, the known risk factors of if you catch COVID, it's very dangerous, include age over 65, being obese, having any previous cardiac or autoimmune pre-existing condition. Just those things for the United States, that's more than 150 million people. So the thought that only the people who are at risk should withdraw, that's not a small number of people. And that's why I think unless you slow the rate of spread of the virus like they have in these other countries, I really just don't see how the economy is going to go back to what it was.
Let's dive into a historical perspective, and we'll start with Ken and look further back, and then I want to zero in on the Great Recession itself. But Ken, you're a scholar of financial crises, and so I think it'd be helpful to set the stage with what you see as the most relevant historical analogs. What are the lessons, or what are the events we should be drawing lessons from as you go back throughout the last century or two and look at the way that we've responded to crises in general, and specifically you mentioned the Spanish influenza. What can we learn about the response today based on the history of such crises?
Well, first of all, this compared to this to the Great Recession, what we often call the global financial crisis in 2008 that started then, this is worse. And first of all, that wasn't really global. That was an advanced country crisis. It hit Europe, the United States. It didn't really hit emerging markets. They had a short-lived normal recession. They bounced back. China, had a short pause and then continued growing like gangbusters. This is truly global. We're seeing a lot of things like in the Great Depression of the 30s, the commodity prices just, falling through the floor, at least non-food commodities. Looking at the collapse in trade is just astounding, by some measures falling 30%. And I don't know how fast that's going to come back. We haven't yet seen the scale of bankruptcies, but that could well be coming, not just in corporations, in emerging markets around the world. So certainly compared to 2008, this is worse. It has other elements. There's what we economists call a supply shock. I don't really know what comes after this. Could we, even if everyone decided everything was all, okay, really come back? Social distancing is going to have an impact on trade, on international travel. It'll, the vaccines as they come are purportedly only going to be 50 to 60% effective. Am I going to still feel like going to a restaurant knowing that the vaccine I got was 50 to 60% effective. I don't know. That's very long lasting. The deglobalization in general that may be coming after this, again, compares to the 30s. But so there's a supply element to this, which could be very long lasting. And the Spanish influenza was very different in that we are much wealthier. Look at what China did in Hubei province, whatever you think, was good or bad about it. They gave food and water to 60 million people. They also basically imprisoned anyone who had COVID. But they were able to do that. I mean, they couldn't have done that 50 years ago. Very few countries were positioned to do that as World War I was ending. And so an enormous number of people died. A low-end estimate is 2% of the global population, 150 million people, and the estimates are often higher than that. So it is something different than anything we've seen before with a lot of elements, but I don't think there's a standard playbook on this one.
Austin, you were in the trenches in the response to the Great Recession, and you had a front row seat for not just the economic fallout, but the crisis policymaking that went on at the time. As you look at the comparison here, and you think about what you've seen so far from Congress and the administration, how does it compare to whether it's the kind of the partisan breakdown or the scale and speed of what was able to be done after the Great Recession versus what's been done so far? I mean, by any measure, we've done a lot in a relatively short period of time, but maybe, again, not enough relative to the scale of the actual crisis we're facing now. So how do you see that comparison stacking up?
Well, as you remember, John, it seemed horrible. At the time, it seemed unbelievably bad. And it was like, well, the only good news is hopefully we'll never have to go through this again in our lifetimes. And, and here we are. Now, there are some ways that all crises have similar notes. There are some ways they're very different. The fact that this one came from totally outside the economy does make it feel pretty different. And so the arguments about stimulus, especially, what we've done so far is not stimulus by conventional definition, I think. That is, it's not about jumpstarting the economy. This, as I say, is literally, well, it's not literally, this is figuratively burning money to stay warm while the furnace is out. And the thing is that can work, but it requires a lot of money to burn. And as long as this thing goes, much of the policy response kind of premised on this is going to be a short-lived phenomenon. And many of the policies only work if it's going to be a short-lived phenomenon, because otherwise, as Ken raised this idea in Europe, they've taken more the approach of paying businesses to keep them on the payroll. Okay, but will that work for cruise lines? If demand for cruises is down for the next 5 years, are they just going to keep paying to have them keep the people on the payroll? They're going to have some decisions like that. One of the lessons of 2008-9, I think that is quite relevant, is that a critical factor in crisis response is you have to maintain public support. And if the public decides we're done with this, it's not working, this is all screwed up, the nation, the nation state loses its ability to keep fighting. And nothing undermines that more than the perception or the reality that the money's not getting out the door, that there are problems with it, that it's going to the wrong people, that we're going to pass trillions of dollars of relief, and they're not going to be asked, the people who receive the money are not going to be asked to do anything in return. We might give out billions and then they fire all the workers anyway and paid out higher bonuses to the executives. As things like that happen, I think it undermines the next rounds. And so in 2009, they passed the first round of stimulus. Then there's all this discussion, well, if the stimulus is so good, why is the unemployment rate still so high? And then it engages a series of bailout fatigue measures where they said, we pass some stimulus and we'll just go back for more if we need it. But you can't go back for more because people have perceived this not working. I think we might very well face that problem now. And it will be worse now because this isn't even stimulus. This is just, we're trying to keep people going and not go bankrupt.
So Austin, there's a certain hindsight somehow to how people view 2008, 2009, which is that if you look at the forecast in 2009 of the Federal Reserve, of the International Monetary Fund, of just about any financial firm you wanted to look at, they were still calling for a pretty vigorous recovery for quite a long time. So you're sitting there, well, it's going to get better. And it's very hard to make the case. And I think that's often forgotten and saying, well, we should have done this and we should have done that. By the same token, I certainly thought doing, and I know you did, thought doing infrastructure would have been a great idea. That builds productivity, it's something we need to do. And you would get the pushback, well, yeah, but it's not going to come online for a long time. It takes a while. I would say the same here, by the way, that infrastructure, great idea. First of all, it's outdoors, a certain amount of it that you can do, and the transmission's less. It's something less affected. A lot of people might be pulled into various aspects of that. And I do think this is going to last a long time. And so ways we can do stimulus that are really stimulus, trying to build the economy, would be, fantastic, among many other things that need to be done. But I wholly agree with what you're saying, that there's a sense in which this isn't stimulus, this is life support.
Yeah, look, when we get to the STEM, I've been for a big infrastructure program for 20 years.
Yeah.
I do think we did learn in 2009 that even the parts of infrastructure that we thought were the most shovel ready, even those took longer than we thought we could get it out the door. So the case to be made for that infrastructure is a good one. It's a little different than immediate relief, probably. But I do think that it's worth thinking about that dilemma that Ken raises, that I hadn't thought of it that way, but in a way, there was a debate at the time between a camp that said, this is going to be a V-shaped recession and recovery, so let's not do a bunch of long-lived things. And another that said, no, this is a financial crisis. It's going to be with us. We're not going to have a V-shaped recovery, so let's do long-lived things. And they kind of went back and forth, and in the end did a little of both. I wonder if we're going to, in a way, the CARES Act is massive, and kudos to our system for coming up with a response as rapidly as it did. I wish we could have acted that rapidly, in the last one. And at the same time, there's always a trade-off that you saw in 2009 and you're seeing again now. There's always a trade-off between getting the money out the door as quickly as possible and making sure the money is going to the people that you think are deserving or who really need it. And the balance between that is tough to do, because if you're really making sure it's going to the right people, then everybody's like, where is the money? But if you charge ahead and give out the money, like with the PPP, then the money runs out and they're like, wait, the Los Angeles Lakers got money. And these giant chains got money. Why did they get money? Why didn't the dry cleaner get money? And I don't know how that's going to play out, but it kind of feeds into this thing about maintaining political support.
That's a good segue into the policy response. I want to dive deeper into that. And so this is a question for both of you, and I want to pin you down a bit. How would you grade the Fed response, the fiscal response, and the response from the fiscal response in general, and the overall performance of Congress and the administration in particular so far? I want you to take each of those in turn. Where do you think we are relative to where we should be with each of those? Who's performing the best in terms of the different levers of response?
Well, I think the Fed's been terrific. They've learned a lot from 2008. and they've, broken the glass wherever they've had to break glass. They've done that. There are issues about whether what they're doing is sustainable, particularly as they move into supporting private credit, supporting municipals, which they've never done before, and creates a lot of governance issues. But they've charged ahead. I think they've done the right thing. There's some definite long-run issues of whether they can restore monetary policy. I frankly would also give Congress and the administration an A for, the first policy response. I know there were a lot of things done wrong and, things that were shaped wrong, and there are things that could be done better, but I wouldn't have believed it that they would have been able to, and we live in this world that's just at war, and been able to shape a policy response. Of course, we're seeing that war now more. And for example, I would say clearly state and local governments need help. And that seems to be sparking a political war, how to move next. I think we need to continue to support people. There's going to be double-digit employment for, I think, at least 2 years coming out of this. And some of it long-term unemployment with people changing. We have to do everything we can, I think, to support Americans. It's going to be costly. Tax revenues are going to be way down for some time to come. So hopefully we can continue to do that and, move ahead. But the first wave was really better than I thought would happen.
Austin, do you share that
Well, look,
positive review?
I tend to agree with Ken almost all the time. Anyway, I was going to make a joke about Harvard grade inflation. He's going to give everybody an A. But look, so here's the thing. Your three categories were Fed, White House, and Congress. Were those the three, or is it two? Monetary.
Fed, the overall fiscal response, and the performance of Congress and the administration.
Okay.
In particular.
All right. Well, I just graded the first two. I want to be clear. I wasn't trying to grade the the individuals because
right. He's not going to make anybody mad.
We do fail some people.
Okay, so as you know, many schools have moved to mandatory pass-fail, and I would say that on a mandatory pass-fail, so far we've passed, but mostly the grades are incomplete. And it's kind of like Ken started from the very first answer, saying there's so much uncertainty. We don't know, depending what happens with the virus, how we're going to look back and about the policy response. I think, as I said before, kudos to Congress and the administration for moving more rapidly than anybody would have reasonably thought possible, and of a magnitude. I mean, to put in context, we've spent almost $3 trillion. That's more than the combined corrected for inflation cost of World War I, plus Korea, plus Vietnam, plus Afghanistan, plus Iraq, all combined over 50 years. We spent that much in basically 2 months to fight this crisis. Now, that said, I think the Fed is doing everything that they can dream of, but monetary policy, I don't think is that effective. So I applaud the Fed for what they're doing, but I think it ought to remind everybody that when they came up with the original unconventional monetary policy, it had a modest impact, because I don't think that the keeping interest rates low on specific types of companies or specific industries or municipalities, it can be helpful, but I really don't think that's going to be where the juice comes from.
But don't you think we were on the verge of a meltdown?
Yes, I do. And that's why I think Ken is right to applaud the Fed for thinking creatively beyond even just the unprecedented measures of 2008, 2009 to a bunch of new stuff to try to avoid that meltdown. But if the stock market is being motivated by, the Fed will save us, I don't know, they better go reevaluate, because I don't think the Fed can save us. I think they can prevent some of the most horrible things from happening, but it's not this is not, stimulus doesn't work until you've got control of the virus in my world. And we don't have control of the virus. So all we're doing is sticking fingers into trying to prevent the dam from collapsing.
Well, Powell says they're not anywhere close to running out of ammunition. So I guess
right.
in light of what you view as the limitations, what are the things that you think they can do?
Is the ammunition they have? I understand why central banks' worldview centers on the ammunition that they have, but it's I don't know what the right analogy is. It's ammunition that doesn't work. These are zombies or something. You shoot them with bullets. That doesn't kill them. Like you'd have to stop the zombie.
And I would say some of the tools are water pistols.
Pistols, right? So,
although I think there are directions they could go that they've ruled out. For example, negative interest rates. I don't want to get in a long discussion, but they've ruled that out. Other than that, they can just keep expanding the federal balance sheet. Let's understand that most of what they've done is fiscal policy, not monetary policy. They've done it in conjunction with the Treasury. But if the Treasury had to do it, then there'd probably be political paralysis. So they've moved in. But what they've done, what they're doing, Lawson is exactly right. If the virus rolls on, I mean, they can guarantee it, but they can't guarantee the customers for the business.
Right.
They can't guarantee anything's going to come back. We need to have that happen. And you can't just wish that would happen. You have to solve the underlying problem.
Okay, so let's take stock of taking stock of where we are now and all the uncertainties that are baked in on the public health side in particular. We just don't know how that's going to play out. What would you be doubling down on at this stage of the response on the fiscal side in particular? What would you be making bigger bets on? And what do you think is less important to do that may have defined the earlier phase of the response?
Well, why don't I start on this one? Like I say, I always say ad infinitum that the number one rule of virus economics is that the best thing you can do for the economy is to slow the rate of spread of the virus. And so I still think, even though we were slow out of the gate, a ramp up of testing, throwing more and more money at the supply chain of medical equipment and the supply of medical personnel is critically important and would be cheap, pennies on the dollar compared with just straight up relief. That said, and I got that off my chest. My fear now is that we're going into the summer and the fall. And that's not the fear. The fear is, as we go into the summer and the fall, the PPP money gives employers a grant as long as they keep people on the payroll to the end of June. And I think that if there is not more direct relief, we are facing a mass wave of bankruptcies of tons of firms, which would immediately cause a second wave of mass unemployment. And then a second and a half wave or third wave is coming right behind it, which is the states are going to be massively short revenue and have a big increase in their automatic stabilization. So they're going to be running deficits, the likes of which we have never seen, and they have balanced budget requirements. So they're going to have to raise taxes like never before in the face of this, or have mass layoffs of the 16 million state workers. And I fear those two whammies they're teed up. You can see them coming. And so in the relief, whatever the next relief is, I think we've got to go try to prevent those bankruptcies, and we've got to try to prevent the states from snowballing this thing.
Before Ken dives in, I just want to underscore a point you made. The small business response has been very tailored to providing short-term liquidity and not at all at dealing with longer-term solvency issues. And that solvency problem is the one you're really describing, where the relief, the short-term relief runs out, and pretty soon you have a business that's not able to maintain a going concern. And none of the current palette of programs that we have, PPP being the largest and the flagship response, are designed for that longer-term challenge. It's a program that seems to have assumed a short duration crisis followed by a quick return to normal. And I think we all agree that's not what we're dealing with. Would you like to see Congress extend the forgivable loan, kind of short-term loan, just for a longer period, and so dialing up PPP, or would you like to see something totally different, a different model for the recovery or longer-term phase of this?
Yeah, back to me, or are you going again?
Yeah, Austin, that's a follow-up for you, Austin. Yeah.
It's hard to say that exactly because the administration has not been very forthcoming with how they're determining who gets the money. And is this really just who's the favorite of the bank is who gets prioritized into getting the PPP money? I kind of think if you could have all the data in the world and make the decisions with no time constraint, you would want to try to start steering more of the money to the businesses that are, what I'm going to call on the margin, and especially the ones that have the bigger social impact. So if employment is going to be the critical issue of our time here, then the companies that are about to shut down and lay off lots and lots of workers, I think you kind of would want to start prioritizing in that space. I don't know if that's what they're doing. You get the sense from what information they put out that it isn't, that they're kind of tasking who should the lending go to just to the banks and, let the banks sort it out. I think that's a little problematic. And so the thought of let's just dump more money into the same system if the system isn't working does make me a little nervous.
Ken, back to you with the broader question of where should we be doubling down?
Well, I follow a little bit the course Austin laid out. I mean, first of all, testing, not just providing money. We need a framework, because I think a lot of doctors' offices don't want to have testing, because if somebody's positive, they have to close it down. A lot of, the pharmacies, they don't want to have testing because if somebody's positive, they have to close it down. So there doesn't just have to be the money for testing and the capacity. That was the initial problem. There has to be a framework. We can operate a lot better with testing. And that's just, that's not a matter of just providing money. It's also providing a framework. We're going to have a lot of bankruptcies. I don't even know how we're going to handle the scale of it. And we want to avoid it, but there's going to be some restructuring too. I'm, in a neighborhood, I live in an urban setting, and there are a few dry cleaners within a mile of me. I don't think there's going to be enough business for all of them the next few years, with so many people from working home, partly coming back. If they all stay in business, they'll all be failing. If one of them, goes out of business, they'll do better. You can make the analogy with a lot of different things. There's a big restructuring in the economy. And then the state and municipal situation, that's a real weakness in the United States for dealing with something like this, because they need to be able to borrow. It's very parallel. We're looking like Europe in a lot of ways. New York State's Italy, where Italy's, the front led in having the pandemic hit them, and it's a catastrophe. Their budget's not in the greatest shape for lots of reasons, but they need help. The Germans and the French actually seem to propose something, by the way. And I think we need to be doing the same. And if we don't, they're going to be, again, just massive layoffs coming from this. This is coming from outside the system. This is not a case of you should have planned for this. I think we need to be able to do more. But lastly, I would say, because of the uncertainty, we have to have something that's flexible. I think if you go back to the 1930s and Roosevelt, we kind of remember the great things he did. He actually tried a lot of not so successful things. He was constantly experimenting, and he was seeing what worked, what didn't work, and he would double down when something worked. And we our political system makes that difficult, but we need to be in a position to do that. Back in 2008, 2009, something people probably don't appreciate how much the Fed did is they were experimenting. They were trying this and that, seeing where it helped. And, it did more in areas where it did. And then this time they were able to follow that. We need some ability to have flexibility when we don't know what's next.
Ken, I want to give you a chance to unpack something you said the other day that I think caught a lot of people's attention. And I'm paraphrasing, but your quote was something to the effect of, if we had to spend another 10 trillion in deficit spending to prevent a deeper crisis, you wouldn't, I think the quote was, you wouldn't blink an ie at that now. And as for anyone who's followed your career, that's a quote that stands out. And so unpack that a little bit. Why are you in a position now where that seems like the appropriate potential scale? And what could be the trade-offs? So you hear a lot of concern about already. You hear spending fatigue from Congress, and we're nowhere close to the number you just mentioned. So I guess there's also a political willpower question of that. What should be the best argument to policymakers that they should not take their foot off the gas just yet?
So first of all, debt is not a free lunch, and people who say it is are out to lunch. They're cost having very high debt, and they reduce your flexibility to respond to things like this. This could have happened in 2011. We know, or 2010, this perfectly well could have happened. The other shoe can drop anytime. You need to be prepared. But at the same time, the US is in a very privileged position right now with the dollar at the center of the global financial system. We're able to borrow. Output, the CBO had output down this quarter almost 40%. It like doesn't get worse than this. If you're saving for a rainy day, this is a rainy day. I think some of what happened, some of the debt battles over the years are really political battles. I would have favored taxing the rich more and higher transfers to lower income people is like a solution, but that wasn't reached. So we're in this very difficult situation and we want to get out of it. And lastly, I would say, on the one hand, debt should not be an obstacle to good policy, to sensible things we should be doing. But at the same time, it shouldn't be an excuse for bad policy. We shouldn't just, burn money to keep ourselves, go off in some crazy direction. It's real money that we're spending. And this is a really severe crisis. So I'm certainly thinking over the context of years that this would unfold. And I think, of course, it'll be a problem at the end of it, but it's not going to be worse than the problem we're facing now. It'll be much less.
Austin, anything to add there?
No, just, I make the joke that it's not even a joke. The last thing you would want Dwight Eisenhower to do in June of 1944 is be thinking, let's use half the boats because I don't have a pay for the landing craft. And how do we keep this revenue neutral? I mean, it's the essence of why debt exists and why would debt be good.
Yeah, is
that you can spread this thing out over a longer period and it all doesn't get concentrated at once. And Ken is right to remind us, we will have to pay for it, but the last thing you want to do is to concentrate all the pay-fors in exactly the same moment when you're dealing with the problems of the disease. And in a way, that's written on a smaller scale. That's the problem that the states are going to be facing, that they're going to have a huge contraction that comes from this disease, and then their balanced budget requirements are going to force them to try to pay for it with austerity in the very moment that they're facing that. And I don't think it can be done.
So what about inflation? Should we be more worried about too much inflation or too little?
Look, I think the economic collapses in the past are not associated with hyperinflation. They're associated with a deflationary spiral where the debt gets more and more costly because you got to pay it back with dollars that are going down. So in the short term, maybe Ken will tell me I'm wrong, but there's no inflation. If we could have 3% inflation, that would be great.
Yeah, well, first of all, I totally agree. Getting 3% inflation would be fantastic. Like having some inflation at the end of this, which wouldn't just help with the federal debt, but it would also help with some of the private debt. I would even say getting 4 or 5% inflation for a few years in the context what we're going through would, be a mild symptom of this. The near term, the overwhelming likelihood is deflation. And Austin described this, what's called debt deflation, where you have a debt that seems, well, I'm not paying a very high interest rate. But on the other hand, we might not have cumulative growth above zero for 5 years. Let me say that differently. Over the next 5 years, our real growth might well be zero. That's a reasonable estimate. And then if you have deflation on top of that, that's challenging. But on the other hand, deglobalization, that's probably pretty inflationary. I think one of the biggest things pushing down prices has been globalization. We're going to see that spin into reverse. Again, we don't know what the long run effects of this are going to be on supply, whether we just won't come out with as vigorous an economy, even as demand picks up. So it's hard to know. I mean, the betting is on deflation and the market is certainly betting on deflation, but I think it's highly uncertain. And an analogy I like to use is from The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy goes up in the tornado and she doesn't know where she'll come down. I think that's how we ought to feel about the economy a few years from now. It's very uncertain.
Okay, two quick exit questions before we turn to some audience questions. First is about the global perspective. And Ken, I'll ask you to dive in on this one first. How do you expect the pandemic and the political response to it to affect globalization, trade relationships, global financial relationships, the connection between the developing and developing worlds? Where do you see all that playing out?
Well, let me make a few points. First of all, where we're talking about building up our debt a lot, most countries can't. The dollar's at the center of the universe, and even countries that have their own debt, government debt in their own currency, their corporations largely borrow abroad in dollars. And when their exchange rate tanks, it makes it very painful and hurts their economies. The US is in really a unique position. Even French firms do 30 or 40% of their external corporate borrowing in dollars. And so we're in a very unique position. Italy's in a horrible position, not just because of its debt, but because it has pensions, 16% of GDP. It's paying out in publicly provided pensions, so just astounding burdens. And because they can't respond, it's going to be worse in a lot of those countries. They don't have the tools that we have to deal with it. Their recoveries will be worse. If you go to emerging markets, I think there's real concern of a desperate humanitarian situation. And I think one thing I would like to see raised on the radar screen is how to help. We're trillions and trillions of dollars we're doing here. They swamp the amounts that the IMF and the World Bank are asking for to help emerging markets. On trade, that's going to center on the US-China relationship. But look, every country's thinking, boy, I need to be able to make my own masks. I need to be able to make my own antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera. We certainly feel we lost control of that too much, and we want to get some of it back. But I worry there'll be an overshoot of this deglobalization, because we had that in the 30s. That's what we're comparing this to. The 30s was the uber deglobalization period, and it greatly exacerbated things. And then the deglobalization could turn out to have a lot of knock-on effects: slower productivity, higher inflation, potentially dramatically in those areas. So the world affects us. I think we want to sort of pretend if we want to pretend we're just an island, we're going to find out we're not.
Austin?
Well, I would bring us back within the U.S. The Economic Innovation Group has done a lot of work about, let's call them disparities in different geographies, before there ever was COVID, some parts of the economy suffered much, much more during the last recession than others did. And different parts of the economy shared in the recovery, and others were largely bypassed. My read of the data so far is that this is making that problem worse. And if you look, the horrible jobs number was April. the Fed put out data in March, and just in March, before we even get to the bigger data, 40% of households making $40,000 a year or less, 40% of households had experienced job loss already in March. So I think that idea that the unemployment rate for college graduates is a little over 8%, and the college and the high school and less education, the unemployment rate is over 18%. That is going to be with us. And then that's also going to play out on the international scale as well. I think the humanitarian crisis that Ken just described has received very little public attention. But I mean, I can't help but think that if you start seeing mass waves of what happened in Italy, let's say, all over the world, I mean, that the impacts on our globalization, the efforts toward globalization and increasing our incomes off of that stuff, I just think it's gonna be a bumpy ride for that.
I just want to make sure to second, because it's so important, something Austin just said. I mean, this is going to exacerbate inequality, and it needs to greatly speed our responses to that. You know, this had been a slow moving thing for decades, and we're seeing a decade of more accelerated inequality in a short period. And I'm sure your studies will show that when this is over, and there needs to be a response about that.
Yeah, you both perfectly anticipated the first audience question that we want to get to, which is how do we prioritize a more equitable recovery once we get past the crisis phase? And just to set the table again, the last decade or more of growth has been one of accelerating inequality in a number of ways, both individual and geographic. And so the fragmentation of growth and who benefits and who participates in that growth looks different over the last, even a record economic expansion like the one we've just come out of, looks in many ways vastly more narrow in terms of who's benefiting than what we saw in previous recoveries. So what can we be doing? Ken, you just said we need to be prioritizing that. In what ways would you begin to prioritize it as we think about the recovery phase?
Well, I think I hear some discussion of cutting taxes more, and I don't think that's the direction of travel that we need going forward. We clearly need many things, but we probably almost certainly need greater redistribution of income as a way, more of a social safety net. I don't see anything going forward in the next 10 or 20 years that's going to take us out of that. Although one of the things that I think you've studied in your studies in the Economic Innovation Group is, small and medium-sized cities versus larger cities. This could change that. We've had since 1980, the large cities, urban centers have gotten richer and richer, and smaller, medium-sized cities have been left behind. I grew up in Rochester, New York, which was once very well off and now much less so, that many of the problems that have afflicted smaller, medium cities have hit Rochester. I think this could lead to people looking to de-densify somewhere, moving to suburbs who had moved into the city, moving into smaller cities. So one note where that might go in a better direction, but there certainly needs to be policy at the federal level and the state level, much enhanced to deal with this issue. It's now just on fire.
I guess I would say two things. I do think that is an interesting point, this shift. Maybe there will be a shift away from the concentration to urban areas to more rural and suburban areas. I think that this space, a lot of large economic catastrophes or challenges, even outside the economic space, have, I guess in my language, changed Americans' view of what a social contract is, and opened the door. Frequently, those have opened the door to the federal government getting bigger, but not in a generic way, but in a, we want the federal government to address blah. So in the Depression, the creation of Social Security, the creation of the safety net, and on the regulatory side, the creation of really financial regulation as we know it. Both of those were expansions of the role of government in the economy that were rooted, I think, in people's dissatisfaction with the social contract broke down. And now we need to redefine it. And then wars, you've had a redefinition. The government needs to protect us. And so there needs to be a bigger government in defense. And I think this crisis is going to usher in a lot of discussion, if not a total changing of the safety net as regards healthcare. I don't see, well, look, we have known that to have most people getting their coverage for health problems through their employer was already a kind of a jerry-rigged system. And now you're going to have 30 million people lose their jobs in the middle of a public health crisis. And that means they're going to lose their health insurance too. I just think that's going to be a space in which I would expect there's going to be a lot of discussion about addressing disparities and inequalities. It's not just about income, but about that access to healthcare.
Absolutely.
One of our participants asks, how do you see immigration policy playing a role in the recovery? And as you think about the recovery phase, what would be the kind of policy approach you would take to making sure that immigration is contributing to a strong and vibrant recovery?
I mean,
Ken,
I don't have to, you don't have to be an expert historian, which I am not, to know that throughout history, pandemics, diseases, and stuff like that are not good for people's attitudes toward immigration. And I think you've seen part of that, and the kind of the rising nationalist sense of let's all build walls and not let anybody in. Things like this contribute to that mentality. And it's a mistake. You know, if you ask any of the economists, they're going to tell you, the U.S. population growth rate, native born, is the lowest it's ever been. We just got the latest numbers in. The fertility rate is the lowest that it has ever been in the United States. And if we have a sustained reduction in immigration, all of these problems associated with the aging population in the United States get worse. One of the strongest points we have on the macro side for the U.S. is we have not had the demographic collapse that they have faced in Western Europe, that they have faced in Eastern Europe, that they have faced in Japan and in other places. If we start severely curtailing immigration, we will have exactly those same problems.
I would just agree. I think this is a big concern going forward. Immigration has been the lifeblood of the U.S. economy for a very long time. We have a culture that can accept immigrants, which frankly, many countries don't. That's part of the reason Japan, Europe don't have as much immigration. It's not all legal, but they don't feel as welcome. And I think we should expand legal immigration when we can, when the virus lets us expand legal immigration. And, you know, it's a very hot, you know, I realize controversial how we should do immigration, but I think we should not stop having immigration. I think we'll really, really notice it. And particularly with our aging population, immigrants have contributed incredibly over the years to the economy. And it's going to be one of the things that hits us the hardest is not having immigration anymore.
So we're at our time. So for the last question, let's do the thought experiment of congressional leadership and the president ask you for your best assessment of what is the best case scenario that we could achieve economically, assuming that we can get our arms around the health crisis aspect of this, and what's going to be required to achieve it. So what's the best case scenario, assuming we're effective at containing the virus? What do we have to do now to achieve that best case result? Ken, you should start.
Oh boy. Well, I mean, if you could contain the virus, I'll do that at almost any price. I mean, that's really the object here. And I think Austin introduced his comments with that. If you could contain the virus, you know, it's fine. That's where the problem. We're being invaded by microscopic aliens, and if you can kill them all, you know, you can grow again. So that needs to be the focus of solving the pandemic, and not solving it, but learning to live with it, testing, anything we can invest in that really does need to be the focus.
And it's no longer theoretical, okay? The good news is there are multiple countries around the world, big countries, not just Iceland and small countries, but big countries that have gotten the spread of that virus down, have materially reduced the amount of fear of people, and that allows the economy to get out of lockdown. The best case scenario is one in which much of the economy fixes itself. If you can get the fear level down, you can get out of lockdown. And this wasn't caused by excessive debt, and this wasn't caused by speculation or oil prices going up or any of the things that are kind of economic shocks that recessions flow out of. So we might be able to come back faster than we did in those others. But you got to get serious about that, controlling the virus side. And I hope that we would let's follow the models that are working. And if we turn on C-SPAN, you might not be heartened that we're going to do it. But I'm still, like I say, I'm still optimistic that sunnier days are ahead, and we just need to dial down.
Well, thanks for ending on an up note, Austin. I want to thank both of you for taking the time to join us today. This was a great discussion. We managed to cover just about everything that the questioners lobbed in at us. I'll kick it back to Catherine Lyons to wrap us up now.
Thanks, John, and thank you again to our panelists. Thanks to also everyone for joining. We will be circulating a recording of this afterward and posting it on our website as well. So thanks again.